Just going to give people another 1 or 2 minutes because somebody's just arrived in the waiting room. Hello everyone, welcome. It's good to see you all. Good to see you, Peter. I haven't seen you in a long time.
Hi, Luke.
Welcome everyone to the AAD Research Seminar. My name's Jane Klossick and I'm the convener of the research seminar. And I'm delighted to announce that this week we've had a last minute substitution. Unfortunately, Johanna Halston was unwell, but Nick Temple has stepped into her shoes and he's going to be speaking alongside Christian Frost, and they're going to discuss architecture, hermeneutics, civic processions, and ceremony. I'll be chairing, and I'm really delighted to be chairing because these are subjects very close to my own areas of research. It would be really great if you could tweet about the seminar. It really helps us. And if you do tweet, then use the Twitter handle @research_LMArts and the hashtag London Met Research. Professor Christian Frost is going to, I think, speak first tonight. Is that right, Christian? You happy with that?
Fine. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Christian is the head of architecture at the School of Art, Architecture and Design at London Met. And his research interests include phenomenological hermeneutics, medieval architecture, and the making of architecture in relation to urban festivals. He's written a book, Time, Space and Order, The Making of Medieval Salisbury, which was published in 2009, and he recently completed his PhD here at AAD, entitled Architecture, Festival and Order, The History and Persistence of the Florentine Feast of San Giovanni and its Significance as a Representation of Civic Order. Speaking second tonight, we have Professor Nicholas Temple. Nick is an architect, academic, and has recently been appointed as a member of the team here at AAD, and he's the Senior Research Professor in Architectural History. His research interests are in architectural humanities, and in particular the role of hermeneutics and historical inquiry in the understanding of architectural representation. His research has explored issues of language, gesture, perspective, ceremony, and symbolism of topography in Renaissance Italy, with specific focus on 15th century Florence and 16th and 17th century Rome. So you can hear from those brief introductions what a lot in common these two speakers have tonight, and I anticipate an extremely interesting conversation afterwards. As usual, both the speakers will speak first and then we'll have discussion afterwards. Please do make comments and ask questions in the chat as we go, if they occur to you, and then I will draw questions from the chat in order to provoke discussion at the end. So Christian, I'll hand over to you.
Okay. So welcome everyone, and thanks for coming today. What I'm going to be talking about a little bit, bearing in mind that I've pretty recently finished my work, my PhD at the London Met, is a little bit about the methodology. As an architect taught by Peter and Dalibor at Cambridge, I sort of was brought up with phenomenological hermeneutics, but didn't really understand that it was a way of thinking. And so I was just doing it. And so when I was doing the PhD and I had to describe the method, I had to go back a little bit and to try to explain to myself why the ways in which I was thinking were actually important or as a part of that work. And what I'm showing you here is a sort of one of the booklets that was a part of the PhD, which described the existing feast of San Giovanni in Florence, and was a critical part of me trying to understand how I could describe continuity and tradition. How could I describe the fact that we have people who'd organised the profession dressed up in sort of strange garments, sitting next to quasi-historical people with contemporary dress all mixed up in the city, walking through the streets and just trying to basically understand how you could use methodologies from the social sciences, or that had evolved from the social sciences, to think about the ways in which we think as architects, trying to explain, for example, the spatial characteristics of Michelangelo's courtyard in the Palazzo Vecchio here in terms of threshold. And because I had to self-consciously describe the methodology, I began to write a chapter which I called The Nature of the Hermeneutics of Ritual. And in doing that, I started trashing all of the other types of methods that wouldn't work. And so, because that's not a very good thing to do in an academic context, very little of that ended up in my PhD. But what I thought was really interesting about the journey that I took on it was that it allowed me confidently to say why I was using the methods that I was using. And today I'm only going to talk about the first part of that. It's about half an hour's worth. It's quite dense at points, but basically it just covers some of the ways in which I felt that these types of experiences, which are sort of steeped in historicity, can be described in a way that is conducive to the way that we think as architects. And in order to do that, I had to sort of go back and start looking at go back to sort of Comte and the emergence of positivism. So that's really what I'm going to look at today. In the end, what it gave me was the confidence to talk hermeneutically about the way in which things work, but it was an important journey to make in order to be able to describe to myself how that works. So you'll hear things about ritual, about pilgrimage, for example, and different ways in which people have viewed those things, and some of the problems that are inherent to that when you're trying to understand or describe what these three images have at the end, which is, you know, tourists, people dressed up in costume but practicing throughout the year, having an emotional and an important symbolic link to the festivals themselves, plus also understanding architecture's contribution. So the Calcio Storico here, this very violent football game that goes on in the city, how if you change the architectural setting to the image below and play the game in a stadium, it changes. And really try to understand how different methodologies can begin to open up those types of things. So bearing in mind it's quite a long test, I'm going to go into it, but I'm just going to leave these images. And so if you can think about having to describe the architecture in relation to these three photos, it'll give you a background as to the sorts of arguments that I'm leading towards. So in the book Contesting the Sacred, the Anthropology of Christian Pilgrimage, John Ede and Michael Salnow bring together a series of papers discussing various aspects of Christian pilgrimage, and argue in the book as a whole amounts to a recognition that pilgrimage is above all an arena for competing religious and secular discourses, for both the official co-optation of the non-official recovery of religious meanings, for conflict between orthodoxies, sects and confessional groups, for drives towards consensus and communitas, and for counter-movements towards separateness and division. Their coverage of this topic provides the association of pilgrimage with ritual and festival, and offers a starting point for assessing the best method for analysing the festival of San Giovanni. In the book, Ede and Salnow argue that paradigmatic meanings built off particular theoretical precepts related to observable pragmatic aspects of pilgrimage are dependent on the narrative brought to the particular situation by the worshipper or the pilgrim. Using Jerusalem as a key example, they suggest that because pilgrimage sites in the city operate equally for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, in all of their various forms, any meaning associated with the site must be brought to the site by the visitor. Quote, the sacred centre then, in this perspective, appears as a vessel into which pilgrims devoutly pour their hopes, prayers and aspirations. But they also contend, along with Marxist theorists, that notwithstanding any ontological aspects of the paradigm, the pragmatic aspects of pilgrimage have their own social implications for everyday life of the protagonist and the society they are a part of. For the authors, quote, pilgrimage is seen as either supporting or subverting the established social order. Within their own critical explanation, a discourse represents the full description of any subject that combines both the visible phenomenon, the pragmatic event, and its theoretical background, the meanings that combine to make up the particular paradigm, both supplied by the particular worshipper at a particular shrine. Camillo Boano, who currently works in the Cities programme at the Bartlett, in his paper Jerusalem as Paradigm, examines Jerusalem using similar terms in an attempt to understand the city as a possible exemplar for urban development. Quote, I hope Jerusalem, with its manifold, uneven and unstable social, economic, colonial and political urban forces and spatial dispositives, could become a signifier of future urbanism, a tertium datur, a paradigm for urban studies. I hope Jerusalem, in its complex dispositif at play in the same territory, could become a theoretical object that one can learn from to better understand urban processes and forms. I'm just going to, and he takes this term dispositive, this is Foucaultian term, and this is what Foucault says about it. What I'm trying to pick out with this term is firstly a thoroughly heterogeneous ensemble consisting of discourses, institutions, architectural forms, regulatory decisions, laws, administrative measures, scientific statements, philosophical, moral and philanthropic propositions. In short, the said as much as the unsaid. Such are the elements of a dispositive. The dispositive itself is the system of relations that can be established between its elements. So, both these texts argue that the landscape of Jerusalem is made up of so many different contesting discourses, it is only through analysis of their relative values that a definitive understanding of the sacred or urbanism per se will emerge. For the authors, even though some aspects of any experience can be communicated, they believe that these differing discourses can never be totally reconcilable with each other within a common telos, a current endpoint or destination, hence their dissimilarity, but could potentially be brought together in a theory that accounts for difference. In setting out these proposals, both Eden Salno and Boano argue that any discourse related to the city should first be categorized theoretically within a clearly defined broad paradigm that incorporates and relativizes several smaller, more structured paradigms. However, while Boano uses Foucault's term dispositif to suggest this active field within which the identity of the city might reside, Eden Salno begin to argue for their realm of competing discourses by suggesting why no single discourse would be sufficient and a new broader understanding is required. They do this first by questioning the value of the positive and structuralist approaches of anthropologists, interested in what they call the functionalist theories of correspondence, who have attempted to build coherent structures of identity purely through empirical observations of social activity. They query how such a method could work in places such as Jerusalem, where each religion establishes a different relationship to the city, apparently creating more than one pattern of correspondence. Such approaches, they argue, cannot ever produce a theoretical fit over a place of such diversity and tend to reveal, perhaps inadvertently, more about the apparent differences between individual discourses than any overall congruence. Then, having suggested that these positive structuralist approaches have limitations, they query an alternative, broader approach offered by Victor Turner. For them, Turner was in search of a deeper universal experience associated with ritual and pilgrimage that, for the protagonist, led to different types of community. Turner labelled these communitas. For Turner, this communitas was formed, revealed and shaped by the ritual itself and was related to a state of what he called being in liminality. And for this, he had three stages. He had separation, which was if you like, the person watching talking to the guy on the left in this image. The second, or the final one, is sort of incorporation, when they're totally involved in these rituals, which you might say is the guys, other guys in the football match or the people in the processions. And then this third stage of transition, which is somewhere in between those two stages, but all three relating to the event itself. And they form this separate community. So this liminality, what emerged is a time out of time characterized as festival time. In this scenario, the variety of experiences people encounter during a ritual are accounted for on an ontological, or with Turner perhaps transcendental level. In their description of this approach, Eden Salno argue that for Turner, the strength of the identity of communities formed in and through ritual is inversely proportional to the loss of identity used as a ground by theorists using structural or structuralist or positivist methods, i.e. the more they identify with the experience of the festival, the less they identify with the everyday social setting. Quote, pilgrimage for Turner, so far from reflecting or reinforcing secular social structure, is a liminal phenomenon which betokens the partial, if not complete, abrogation of the structure, and tends towards communitas, a state of unmediated, egalitarian association between individuals who are temporarily freed of hierarchical secular roles and statuses which they bear in everyday life. As a result of this interpretation of Turner, Eden Salno dismissed Turner theory of discourse that relates, and they call it, that they think it relates more a particular discourse about pilgrimage rather than as an empirical description of it. Having then questioned these two positions, the positivist first and Turner's proposal, which displays dialectical pretensions, they suggest in order, quote, in order to transcend this somewhat simplistic dichotomy, it is necessary to develop a view of pilgrimage not merely as a field of social relations, but also a realm of competing discourses. Even though Eden Salno clearly accept the need for more than one discourse in order to avoid weaknesses associated with accepting the authority of only one, this apparent devaluing of Turner's more ontological approach during the explication of their methodology raises some questions as to how valuable their new methods can be in evaluating any form of ritual. Although pilgrimage rituals themselves are visible through contemporary manifestations and can be described as such, they also have an ontological component, and their origins are much older than the methods Eden Salno advocate. As a consequence, it could be argued that in the past, the participants' value systems would have created discourses more in tune with each other than they appear today. Eden Salno's approach, therefore, will inevitably tend towards what I call an operational, rather than a full evaluation, where the limits are set by the discourse, not the situation being evaluated. So this is a really key point, I think. In addition to this problem with their paradigm, even given the desire for the rich combination of discourses to reveal the truth of the ritual setting of Jerusalem, they relegate anything not pragmatic to the realm of theory, to what they define as paradigmatic. But in this process, their sense of paradigmatic is also very limited and does not represent a real understanding of similar conditions in, say, the medieval period when many of these rituals would have been established or at least reinforced. For example, John Cassian, writing in around the 4th century, articulated a way of understanding scripture originally conceived as a guide to monastic Bible study, using various levels: the literal, the allegorical, the tropological, and the anagogical. This is from him. Jerusalem can be taken in 4 senses. Historically, literally, as the city of the Jews. Allegorically, as the Church of Christ, in the sense of the institution rather than of the building. Anagogically, as the heavenly city of God, which is the mother of us all. And tropologically, as the soul of man, which is frequently subject to praise or blame from the Lord, often under this title. Pilgrimage in this context is very different from that described by Eden Salnow. For them, only the literal aspects of this scheme could be characterized as pragmatic. Consequently, the remaining three aspects of the city, according to Cassian, would have to be subsumed into a broader discourse as a part of the theory. This may not necessarily have become a problem, except that although it can be seen how tropology and allegory could easily form a successful part of a theoretical tract, the anagogical aspects would be more difficult to accommodate. Indeed, this more ontological aspect of the discourse would only become evident to the degree that it impacts on the other three. Hence, when Turner tries to articulate something of this part of the ontological aspect of ritual in contemporary sense, it is consigned by Eden Salnow as something different, lying outside the relevant information that can be safely associated with the event. It is seen as a condition about rather than of the festival. In order to unpick these distinctions between different methods and articulate the intentions, this paper, in relation to the festival rituals of Florence, these concerns raised by Eden Salnow and their conclusions need to be discussed in greater detail, and issues relating to ritual need to be clarified. This process will emerge as one of recovery rather than as fabrication. Because the part of the problem with hermeneutics, with people in some who have such often have a much stronger sense of an ideology based on a methodology, is they call hermeneutics a relativist or shifting sands, the notion of something that isn't fixed. So this notion of understanding it as a fabrication, as a relationship to interpretation and understanding, is critical. Consequently, the issues that led to the loss or suppression of meaning will first need to be evaluated before an account of recovery can be articulated clearly. The ground for this begins in the Enlightenment and the attempts by key thinkers of the period to use reason to analyse aspects of human social behaviour that are not necessarily governed by reason. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Comte. In the face of mounting industrialisation and the prosecution of wars and revolutions of the 18th century in the West, there arose a need to redefine the basis upon which modern society could be evaluated without recourse to the order of the church and the social structures of the Ancien Régime. Within this culture, there was a belief that by adopting the methods of natural science, the social sciences would be able to successfully appraise the conditions of contemporary society. As a consequence of this association, the methods used by natural science quickly became the criterion for theoretical relevance in general. Positivism's use of scientific method in the human sciences emerged as one way of achieving this goal. One of the first thinkers who attempted to articulate this process of evaluation in relation to the study of society was Auguste Comte, 1798 to 1857, who in his 1829 work, Causes de philosophie positive, offered 5 key methodological principles for the advancement of knowledge pertaining to society. Firstly, for knowledge to be scientific and therefore of value, it had to be based upon a positive empirical experience of reality, le réel, not founded in knowledge related to the metaphysical or theological ideas. Secondly, it was important that this experience was repeatable as common experience, la certitude. Thirdly, the study should be underpinned by a theoretical framework that could be tested empirically, le précis. Fourthly, the knowledge should be concerned with means and not ends, rendering it useful, utile. And finally, Comte suggested that all scientific knowledge was incomplete, le relative. But because of its precision and structure, it inevitably progresses towards an understanding of everything. For Comte, the decision to utilize these methods in the analysis or evaluation of society rendered not only the method, but also the period positive and more advanced than any other ages in a progress of humanity. To illustrate this, he separated history into 3 parts. Firstly, its long infancy, which, this is a quote, which fills the whole of antiquity had to be essentially theological and military. Its adolescence in the Middle Ages was metaphysical and feudal. Its maturity, which has only begun to be appreciated in the past few centuries, is necessarily positive and industrial. The desire to define and divide civilization into distinct ages of mankind did not begin with Comte. It has happened throughout history. However, each attempt, based on a distinct set of ideas and principles, has a different timescale, as well as different prejudices built into its self-understanding. For example, Joachim de Fiore in the 12th century, a follower of St. Francis, applying the symbol of the Trinity to 3 ages. The first, the age of the Father, the Old Testament and the laws. Then the age of the Son, the New Testament, when God became man. And finally, the impending age of the Holy Spirit, when a true understanding of the gospel would be possible. These 3 stages were characterized as the age of the layman, Abraham, the age of the priest, Christ, and finally the age of the monk, St. Francis. This stratification impacted on later historians such as Petrarch in the 14th century, who, among other humanists, described the 3 ages of ancient history, medieval history, the Middle Ages, that's where it comes from, and modern history, which began for Petrarch in the period of the Renaissance, aligning both the ancient and modern periods with that of light, thus condemning everything in between as dark, at the Dark Ages. In the 20th century, this hasn't stopped. Obviously, we have Hegel, which I'm not going to go into, but also in the 20th century, Germany's Comte's trinity of theological, metaphysical, and scientific phases were hijacked in a rather mundane manner by the National Socialists in order that they could themselves become the fulfillment of history. In their history of progress, the first phase was interpreted as the German Reich that ended in 1806 with Napoleon's victory at Austerlitz and the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine that followed. The Second Reich was that overseen by Bismarck, crushed in 1918, both leading to Hitler's millennial Third Reich. Although the National Socialist claims for earthly fulfillment are most obviously mundane, the same can also be claimed for all of these attempts at understanding the fulfillment of history. They all assume that meaning in history is accessible to human knowledge. Joachim, like Petrarch, and Arthur Moller van den Broek were all trying to make sense of the course of history and thereby give it meaning. However, although these terms, stated by Joachim de Fiore, would suggest a long, broad history of this phenomenon, this is not really the case. Joachim was not a part of mainstream Christian thinking, and his work was condemned by the Fourth Lateran Council, as well as by Thomas Aquinas later. Equally, Petrarch's condemnation of the Middle Ages, although picked up and proliferated by many later historians of the Renaissance, did not totally hold sway. And within various representational possibilities of culture, themes from classical times which had been preserved and adapted through the so-called Dark Ages still persisted well into the Baroque era, where, as Vesely says, the unity of Baroque space, for example, was established by the metaphorical structure of space, which has the capacity to hold together different arts at the same time, and at the same time meet the important conditions of practical life, decorum and ethos, just as it had done so in the so-called Dark Ages. The condemnation by Aquinas and the developing fields of perspectivity within the late medieval world that accompanied Petrarch suggests there was, even at that time, a resistance to this reductive process of historical periodization and oversimplified hierarchies of order based upon empirical knowledge. However, the desire for immanent worldly understanding was clearly present in all these examples. The difference was that during the 19th century, this desire coupled with the use of the scientific method. The emergence of the Third Reich is the progeny of this particular coupling. The difference being that whereas Petrarch and Joachim were attempting to explain extra mundane ideas of progress through mundane activity, positivism tended to deny anything extra mundane existed at all. Through the 19th century, various attempts were made at articulating a compromise on a complete discourse on society, as well as propositions suggesting a hierarchy of ages as one of these by the sociologist Max Weber.
Sorry to interrupt you, Christian. I just wanted to let you know you've had 22 minutes.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to speed up a bit.
Great, thank you.
And began to suggest other aspects of the problem. He too described the history as a form of progression, as a process of increasing rationality, but also articulated this journey in terms of a loss, as a process of disenchantment and de-divinization. For him, like Kant, the rational thought that underpinned rational values led to rational actions and hence progress. However, conversely, he also described other demonic factors active within the development of society, but not governed by rationality. For Weber, with the advance of rationalization, these forces became less significant, hence the terminology of loss. This balance of progress and loss lies at the heart of the different models of society argued for in the 19th century. And as a result of this fact, social behaviour began to be described differently depending on the values considered significant within a particular model, both rational and demonic. Over the course of the 19th century, several different models of society emerged and began to compete for attention, all the while apparently oblivious to the difficulties of temporality built into them by their methodology. Put simply, progress of society was believed to be synonymous with the advances of reason and technology. Any notion that progress could be measured against other ideas, such as ethics or the common good, were for the most part ignored. So as well as limiting the possibilities of meaning in history to material factors governed by reason, this attitude placed particular pressures on the present, cementing limitations of the model representing present society into future visions of society and the city. As a consequence, these various models were for the most part short-lived, rigid and unprogressive. The facts that validated the system were fixed and often unable to withstand the changes that were necessary for actual progress to occur. If the structure was seen to change, this was considered a paradigm shift, where the internal values credited with establishing coherence to the model of the world, like Comte's 5 key principles, had either been questioned beyond their capacity to remain valid, or was superseded by a new set of values which began to be mapped against reality. The scientist Thomas Kuhn explains this in his what constitutes a paradigm that might be taken as a worldview and then superseded in his structure of scientific revolutions. I'm not going to quote, there's a quote that goes with that. But he mirrors Comte's 5 points. In this program of requirements, an echo of Comte's 5 points can be seen, but for Kuhn, the moment the model is challenged by a better model, it should be discarded. However, although this theory of revolution should be characterized as a critical clarification of how models adapt and are superseded, it does not necessarily clarify or identify the problems inherent to understanding the world through the use of models in the first place. For the most part, the inbuilt challenges implied in any model mean that its relative success is ascertained by its ability to withstand criticism from other similarly structured hypotheses, rather than against how well it represented the world. As such, social theory grew into conflict between models, each competing for primacy, considered purely on their ability to map and predict the conditions alive in the world at the time, not in history, and, as both Comte and Kuhn suggest, gradually approach the truth of reality and hence embody all progress. Therefore, it can be argued that the periodization of history has built in with it an inherent prejudice towards pragmatic perception, in terms of persistence of present values based purely on the physical world, and additionally appears to hold particularly utilitarian understanding of nature. It not only suggests that values recognized as critical to the present mature society and is used as a tool for its evaluation are more significant than other values held by earlier manifestations, the new values represent how far society has progressed. It also dominates the way the past and nature can be viewed. In these constructions, future success is predicted on the possibility of moulding both society and nature. It is purely based upon models of intervention and change. In this world, nature became the passive partner of man's destiny, subject only to his will and associated through its non-alignment with reason with a lack of culture and demonic powers. The applications of Comte's 5 methodological precepts to this evaluation of all civilizations, whether or not the precepts were valued in the societies that were being questioned, resulted in different societies being described in terms of primitivity, allowing Western culture and the white man at its center to maintain his superiority over all other manifestations of culture that could not be evaluated rationally, no matter how sophisticated these manifestations might be. I'm going to skip a bit here and then go on. So what I'm going to talk about now is just 5 questions that ask, can the positive approach, or could this type of thing be used as a method to help understand the Feast of San Giovanni? So these 3 photographs we're looking at. So firstly, the method is formed upon the idea that society has distinct changes of growth, Comte's 3 stages, whereas any understanding of the continuity of the feast or any type of ritual would suggest that there is at least some aspect of continuity. So there isn't 3 stages. We're not looking for perfection. Secondly, it suggests that these distinct stages will progress and converge towards a single point. In Comte's case, the perfect description of society through science. Again, this presupposition is alien to the experience of a festival or a ritual, where no ultimate or perfect festival or setting for festival is sought or thought necessary. The third problem relates to the tendency to objectify the thing that is being viewed, which becomes problematic when one is trying to evaluate an activity that must be experienced. It draws too distinct a line between object and subject. Fourth is the silence and neutrality of the observer. As we have seen from early discussion and the description and the sort of pictures of the feast, the degrees of participation experienced within the festival are varied and difficult to categorize as neutral or outside the event itself. And the fifth is the problem of associating different forms of engagement or knowledge with knowledge of the event. In evaluating real events, both the objectification of the festival and the silence of the viewer in the process, points 3 and 4, are problematic insofar as they suggest it is possible to describe and evaluate some aspects of the pragmatic experience of the event without at least some recognition of the broader cultural setting. In this regard, the event itself will inevitably prove too difficult to decipher. Also, as point 5 suggests, because the method renders any understanding of the event in the form of knowledge, episteme, based on the material world, it implies that hierarchies of involvement are created and administered through access to and understanding of this knowledge. The description of the festival, or these footballers that we can see here, would suggest that's not as simple. Degrees of participation are certainly a critical part of the festival praxis, but the hierarchy is not based upon knowledge in any empirical or scientific sense. One could argue that the protagonist in this football match, the culture storico, stands at the heart of the festivication as agonistic ritual, but it is unlikely that they have the most formed knowledge of the overall iconography of the day. Something else is required to begin to understand this aspect of ritual and its setting. As it stands, if a simple scientific approach were undertaken of the event, all the points highlighted above would make the depth of the festive experience described almost impossible to comprehend and evaluate. In fact, if this method were used, it would either deny any possibility of such experience occurring at all, or render the experience superfluous to any evaluation of the event qua event. As a result, it would dramatically reduce the possibility of evaluating the possible contribution of the event to the order of the city. In sum, the reductive nature of positive evaluation would make the nuanced experiences that one can see happen in the festival almost completely invisible. So, as a final point, in relation to festivals, such methods can offer critiques of many of the problems of analysis, but can never clarify aspects of the shared relationship between the protagonist in the calcio storico and the tourist based on the knowledge it advocates. For that, we would need to move into the situation as experienced both historically and in the present. That is the basis upon which historicity, inherent to hermeneutics, would be required. And I'm going to stop there. There's a lot more that I sort of did in terms of picking out other particular forms of methodology, but I think you get the basic idea that you can pick all of these others apart. But what's the most important thing is to recognize what's left silent in the methodologies that don't necessarily engage with architecture or festival in the way that we would perhaps like to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Let's go straight into Nick's talk. I can see that Matthew has already posted an interesting comment in the chat. Everybody else, you're very, very welcome. No question or comment is too silly, even if the speakers, as Christian did, sound very intellectual. Please don't be overwhelmed. In any way that you can contribute, even if you feel a bit nervous, it makes the seminar a better place. So please bite the bullet and make a comment. Nick, you are muted.
Hang on. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yep. Right. Sorry. Right. It's a difficult act to follow after Christian's presentation. So I just want to first of all apologize because I had to put this together very quickly today with the last minute cancellation. So, but I think it kind of nicely follows a lot of the points that Christian has made in his really exquisite presentation on just looking at the issue of pilgrimage, but within this much broader context of concepts, understanding of historicity, and the whole notion of participation. My presentation is also located in Florence, but I'm going to be looking at it in a context of, or broad in relationship to a number of texts, specifically a fragment of a text which was written by Martin Heidegger in 1939. It's one that's probably less known amongst his works. It was never finished. Basically, the lecture notes subsequently translated and published in English in 1999 called The Essence of Language. And I'm going to be referring to that in the midst of this investigation. I'll start with a quote. And this is, sorry, I'm just trying to, yeah, this is a quote. Unfortunately, I can't read the whole quote because all the photograph, the images of people in front of it. So you're going to have to bear with me. You'll have to read it yourself. Essentially, this is taken from this fragment of notes from a lecture that Heidegger delivered in 1939. And it's, as I said, it's in reference to an investigation of a lesser known meditation on language, which was written in the late 18th century by a less known German philosopher called Herder, Johann Gottfried von Herder, on the origin of language. And Heidegger basically says that human being is only human being through language. So he's making basically the statement that the essence of human being, which differentiates us from other animals, is our capacity to communicate through language. And this is one of the essences of Herder's really quite detailed investigation that Heidegger draws upon to try and seek the origins or the essence of language. The traditional metaphysical appearance of language, I'm afraid I can't read this. Sorry, because I've got these photographs, images in front. It's not accident. The human being first takes the, sorry, I can't read it
for you, Nick. Do you want me to? The traditional metaphysical appearance of language, not accidental, that the human being first takes the word as sound, form, and sign of the thing.
Yeah.
The supremacy of beings in general, and this displacing of the vulgarisation, Vulgarisierung, of the word in the word sound.
Now, thanks a lot, Christian. The point I'm focusing, this is where the area that I've highlighted in red, is this idea of the displacement of vulgarization of the word in the word sound. The thing that Heidegger highlights and uses the word vulgarization, which is kind of interesting because it becomes relevant to this particular presentation of language, which I'm trying to explore in the context of Renaissance culture. The idea, in a sense, of language, first of all, as essentially speaking to oneself, the thought, then it becomes basically, it comes into appearance, so to speak, through the utterance, through the sound, through the translation into communication with the other. And in the process of that transformation, he describes it as vulgarization into the word sound. So what is true to oneself as a particular set of truths, and we're talking about here in the context of Renaissance, late medieval Renaissance culture, we're talking about something which in many respects is embedded in an ontotheological tradition, an ontotheological outlook. So that relationship between the idea of the inner word, the logos, and its manifestation through exposition, through communication, through the sermon, through the oratory, through the demonstration, is the one that actually is crucial to our understanding of the meaning of language in the Renaissance. But one particular aspect of it and how it manifests itself or finds expression in the use of spaces, physical spaces, and modes of representation. So that's kind of broadly what I'm exploring here. It forms the basis of a book which came out this year called Architecture of the Language Debate, Artistic and Linguistic Exchanges in Early Modern Italy. And the book was the product of a number of years of research, both in Florence and in Rome, and gave rise to a series of studies. We're only going to look at the first one at the top, early 15th century, the early Renaissance, which I describe as the period of poetic language, the relationship between Vulgare and Latin. Vulgare is the notion of vulgarization, the vulgar tongue. It's the language of the common people versus Latin, which is the sacred language or the language of scholarship. And the relationship, the rivalry between the two languages as it was understood in the early Renaissance is really what I'm looking at in the context of the social cultural context of the city of Florence. The second, I'll just go through the other chapters, even though I'm not going to be looking at them in this presentation. The second one draws upon the emergence of archaeological interest in the late part of the 16th century. This is obviously just before the beginning of the Counter-Reformation. What I describe as resuscitative language antiquarianism, where language begins to be transposed into the material finds of ancient Rome, and how Rome itself was being literally reconstructed. And in the process of reconstruction, we get the capacity of fragments to speak a language, to utter, to give certain kinds of communicative messages. We see this manifested in many different ways, actually, in late 16th century Rome, through the reuse of statues, the application of inscriptions on statues, as if statues acquired the power of speech to communicate back, to convey things that are often hidden or concealed, a new knowledge, acquiring a certain kind of mystical, but sometimes also quite humorous elements that are presented as well in the social political climate of late 16th century culture. Then the third chapter, I describe it as universal language, ethnography. This is the period in which we get the establishment of trading, the age of discovery, where Rome becomes the epicenter of a massive network of pilgrimage routes around the colonization and routes of Jesuits, firstly Franciscans and then Jesuits, to try and convert different parts of the world to the Christian faith, as far afield, of course, as China and also in South America. And what that gave rise to was this idea, this concept of a universal language, conceived initially by a group of Jesuits, but also manifesting itself in architecture. Baroque architecture is often described as the first universal international mode of architecture, because it manifests itself in many different parts of the world, such as Mexico City and Beijing. And then we get early 18th century. The last chapter, what I look at is the notion of pastoral language, are kind of retreating from the universal claims of language in the 17th century and how they were manifested architecturally, into a kind of return to what one could describe as a kind of quasi-primitivism, a return to the primitive simplicity of Christianity, getting back to its roots. So the reactionary forces that happen at the same time as the age of science, scientific investigation, which actually follows very closely aligned with this idea of a kind of archaeological interest in early Christianity and how this idea of the city of the Christian faith could be resurrected almost in a kind of quasi-scientific way. And one of the key figures I look in the final chapter is obviously Vico, the famous Neapolitan philosopher. So I'm going to be looking at the first one, which is this issue of the relationship between the vulgar language and Latin in the context of Renaissance culture in Florence. This is a diagram which Christian will no doubt know. It's a familiar one with a lot of ex-students of Peter Carl probably recognize, but it's a diagram which I actually used for my book because it was, for me, it was very, very helpful. It's essentially a kind of analysis of the relation between word and image. And it kind of starts, I mean, even the terms that Carl actually uses and the articulation of these relationships, starting from the concrete, moving to the conceptual, vertically, but horizontally moving between word and image, where we have rhetoric aligning itself with perspective, what Carl describes as poetic device, which is then analogously related to the picture or the scene. And right at the top, when we get it the most conceptual, the most abstract, verging on the abstract, we get the syllogism versus geometry and how these two things are presented. And this, for me, provides a nice kind of framework for thinking about these relationship between the visual and the linguistic actually in Renaissance culture. And it's one which actually is really difficult to explain. It's difficult to articulate. And as Christian has said, this real problem, the kind of hermeneutic issue, which for many, I think many contemporary writers, thinking that they have some understanding of historical matters, completely lose a sense of the interconnectivity, the interrelationship between these things, that the idea that you can silo these things and separate them out as kind of rational areas of focus, identifying difference rather than similarity and transposition, and analogous relationships which just exist by default, by the way in which the life, the cultural life of the city existed, is something that to me is fundamental to how we understand the culture in the late medieval Renaissance period. So this was really the kind of background to the research. The research also drew upon two previous books that I wrote. One quite a few years ago, 2007, which was called Disclosing Horizons, Architecture, Perspective and Redemptive Space. And it's a piece that I started writing when I was teaching in University of Pennsylvania, and provide the basis of a study of perspective. And it formed the basis of a seminar series with a group of students, and really looks at the changing modalities of perspective through history. So we think of, again, we think of perspective as some kind of given structure. It's simply a simple geometric operation, but actually has a deeply rooted cultural purpose. And also, obviously, in its original exploration and demonstration, also presented deeply theological issues as well embedded within it. So I explore that through the lens of buildings, through architecture, both historical and contemporary. And the second book, and you'll see in a minute why perspective becomes an important factor in this investigation. The second book is a book I wrote more recently, 2011, published in 2011, which actually focused on Rome and what we describe as the Renovatio Urbis, the urban renewal of Rome, or the urban cultural renewal of Rome, the beginning of the 16th century during the period of Julius II. And many of the themes that came out of this book became very important as a way of framing my arguments in the book on architecture and language, hence the inscription on the front cover. Anyway, just to kind of, by way of kind of articulating this within a more recent critical framework, I'm just referring to Alberto Perez Gomez's really interesting book. For me, it was a very useful book. Actually, I read this when I wrote my own work, or research my own work, on attunements, architectural meaning after the crisis of modern science. And I'm not going to read the text because I can't read it all, because I've got these photo images in front of me. But the point that Gomez talks about essentially is the idea of language as emergent, that speaks to us basically through our own bodies, captures meaning in its mesh. Words point towards meaning, but never, sorry, I can't read the other, never fully coincides. I'm partly guessing because I can't read the text. So this idea, in a sense, that there is this, the notion that the emotion that's conveyed, that one wants to express and translate through language, these two things never completely coincide, but there's always a kind of gap. But also that language itself, and as I've highlighted, is emergent. And that's the thing I'm trying to explore, particularly in the context of Renaissance culture, and why it's important looking at the intellectual debates that centered around language and how this notion of emergence also manifested itself architecturally, urbanistically through the city. So the first part I'm looking at, I call it the communicative dimensions of language. And I'm going to be referring to a debate that actually took place in 1435 in the cloisters of Santa Maria Novella in Florence. And the debate was actually with a group of humanists. And the debate centered around, I should provide a little bit of context here. 1435, very important period, because it was a time where an important council was held in Florence. It's called the Council of Florence, previously in Ferrara. It was a very important event because it brought together officials, the cardinals, the bishops of the churches of the Greek Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church under the auspices of Eugenius IV. This was just following an important civil war, civil unrest in the Catholic Church. So it was a period of great instability. So we had, you know, in Rome, in Florence, we had representatives of the Eastern Orthodox Church from places like Russia, Ukraine, Armenia, and of course in Greece, different parts of Greece, arriving, these foreigners, these aliens, different languages spoken that many Florentines had never heard of, ways of dressing that people had, their kind of exotic appearances in the streets of Florence for about 4 or 5 years. This is how long the council went on for. So there was this kind of strange sense of a kind of invasion of multi-culture, many different cultures and languages. And it was in the context of this that this debate happened. And it was an informal debate during a period of absence of Eugenius IV, actually in his own apartments. And it was with a group of humanists. They were the papal secretaries. And the debate centered around language. And the language that they're talking about is the relationship between Latin and the Vulgate, the vulgar tongue, that is the Italian language. We have to remember, in the period that we're talking about, Italy had multiple local languages. There wasn't one Italian, there were many different regional languages, and they're all slightly different. They all had different dialects. There was no structure, there was no rules of the language, nobody had written a dictionary about the language. So everybody kind of invented their own language. It was a language of the people. It was one that was enormously poetic. It was more conducive to poetic expression probably than Latin. And as a result, there was a kind of certain disquietness. There was a certain uncertainty about the future of Latin as the authoritative language of the church. Notaries, legal notaries in Florence, when at the time, at the end of the 14th century, were required to speak the vulgar language because it's the language of the people. So the debate actually centered around about the whether, in fact, in ancient Rome, there was also a vulgar language like they existed in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Or did the Romans actually all speak Latin? Was Latin the language of the masses? So did they have an alternative language? And there were these different disagreements, these different points of view among these humanists. And what basically transpired out of this informal debate, which gave rise to a whole series of other events, was that actually in Rome, their vulgar language was Latin, although the Latin itself was not as the refined Ciceronian Latin that had been extracted out of ancient Rome and then essentially ossified as the perfect language in the period of the Renaissance. So that debate was interesting, and particularly in the context I've just highlighted. At the same time that this debate took place, there are a whole series of other events that were happening in Rome and across Italy, Rome and Florence. One of which concerned the invention of cursive script. The cursive script was an invention of the Renaissance, and the reason why it became an important part of the initiatives to make language more communicative was because there was a huge amount of translation going on at the time. Amongst the main figures who invented cursive script was somebody called Poggio Bracciolini. Poggio Bracciolini was a book hunter, and he brought to Florence from different parts of Europe amassed a large amount of books and manuscripts, some of them perhaps even stolen from many of the monasteries in other parts of Europe. And these were subsequently translated and also transcribed using the cursive script. At the time, the old Gothic script, which was the more typical one, or the Carolingian script, were very cumbersome and very difficult to read. And so in order to expedite the process, the cursive script was invented. So we get the beginnings of a kind of rationalization and this need to increase the process of transcribing these texts and getting them actually accessible to other humanists in the court. So this was part of the revolution of language in the period of time. Now, in the church, the monastery of Santa Maria Novella, where this debate took place, a very, very important painting had already been completed, one which is familiar to most of us when we go to Florence, the Holy Trinity of Santa Maria Novella. And this, of course, was highlighted as one of the first examples of complete work in the skill of perspective application in fresco painting. And just to kind of recap the construction of the perspective, the iconography, essentially the Trinity actually presents the crucified Christ, the Godhead standing behind him, holding up the cross. And then below him, we see St. John and the Virgin Mary sitting within the zone, within the space of the cross. And then slightly outside the archway, we have the two donors, those who actually contributed the funds for the painting, which are kind of in the space of the viewer, the physical viewer. And then they're sitting on what looks like a massive sarcophagus, which is, and you can see at the bottom of the painting, a skeleton. And just above the skeleton, you can see an inscription, a painted inscription. So we have this kind of perfect hierarchy of this work, almost kind of re-articulating Carl's diagram that I showed you earlier, constructed perspectively, but also very much orientated to the viewer within the center of the basilica. The viewing point was the center space of the basilica. If we go through it in more detail and we actually look at what was written, what we find out is the painted inscription at the bottom wasn't actually written in Latin, but was written in Vulgare, in the Italian language. This is the Tuscan version, the Tuscan dialect. And that in itself is telling. Most inscriptions in churches would not be written in the Vulgare, would be written in Latin. That is the language of the learned community, learned societies of the clergy. So there's some kind of intention here presented. There's all sorts of theories about why this was written in the Vulgare. And if you translate it, it's fairly basic message here. What you are, I once was. What I am, you will be. So essentially that the corpse is telling you'll be like me soon, so make the best of it in your own living existence. So there's something interesting about the idea of the Vulgate is the language of mortals, the language that actually requires life to live to the fullness of life, versus the idea of the eternity of life, the eternity of the message of theology, of the sacred texts in Latin. And this represents the lower strata of this hierarchy that moves into, obviously, into the kind of transcendent realm of the crucified Christ held up by the cross, by God in the background. So this becomes a very interesting reference point of thinking about this issue of the Vulgate. Dante was one of the key references in this discussion, as I'll describe a bit later. But he wrote a very important, right at the end of the 14th century, Dante was, of course, the great Italian poet, wrote also a really interesting study on language called On the Eloquence in the Vernacular, De Vulgare Eloquentia. And the text is interesting because Dante wrote all his poems in the vulgar language, not in Latin. So we have the most prestigious, the most venerated poet in the Italian culture not writing in Latin. He did write in Latin, but actually his greatest works were written in the Vulgate. And this particular work actually differentiates between Latin and the Italian vernacular, saying that Latin is a frozen language. That's how he pretty well describes it. Whereas the Vulgate is the language that is living, it's pulsating. It's in a state of constant change. It's a sort of change, it's a language in gestation. So, and he uses the analogy of the Tower of Babel, talking about before the God's wrath in the building of the temple, which gave rise to the proliferation of tongues, the confusion of communication, the loss of communication between people, is that the tower itself was built around different trades. So he uses the analogy of the building trades and the builders not talking to each other, and confusion ensues as the perfect analogy of this idea of language. And
sorry to interrupt you there, Nick, but we've only got 20 minutes left of the seminar.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
it would be good to have a bit of time for chat. If you could draw it to a close, I'd really appreciate that. Thank you.
Right. This in the course of this investigation, one of the key works that was written just 2 years after the debate that I highlighted was by Leon Battista Alberti. He was the great architect. He was the first person to write a dictionary of the Italian vernacular, and it's called the Grammatichetta, 1437. And this is a really interesting work because he attempts to rationalize the vulgar language, to break it down into its kind of essences. I won't go into the details, but what's really interesting is we have an architect effectively codifying the vernacular language, this unruly language that needed some kind of structure. When Alberti wrote this text, he also wrote two other, before and after, two other seminal texts, which actually have a bearing on understanding of language. The first one, of course, is the Della Pittura, and the second one is an unfinished work, and what we have is a simple description. It's the Survey of Rome, which was produced. And each one we see something quite important. The same kind of mindset in which Alberti applied to language, he also applied to the structure of pictorial space and the surveying of land. And the way in which geometry, we'd call broadly algorithm, and the idea of historia, the idea of a simple representation of a narrative through its fixity, through pictorial space, was very clear analogies to the way in which he tried to define language through this idea of a kind of rationalization of in his Grammatichetta. I won't go into that detail, but anyway, going back to this text that Heidegger referred to, he progressing this a bit further, Heidegger talks about this notion of inner world becomes outer. He describes the idea of speaking, announcing. So this idea of the inner voice and then how it manifests itself. And these are unfinished notes. So these are not sentences, hence some of them are a little incoherent. He says the simple, fundamental power of the essence of the human being, the reflective awareness as the coming into being of language. So he has this idea of the analogies between the range of speech and vision in being, in human being, what it means to be human. And he conveys this in this idea of the circle and the idea of a kind of terrain of language, a communicative terrain of language, analogous to the idea of the field of vision. So I won't go into that in detail. So looking at this in the context, in fact, what I might do is I might jump these and view the fact we are running out of time. I'll go straight to this. I'll go straight to this one. As part of the kind of background to this question of debate of language, there was a very important contest which was organized by Alberti. So he was the architect, later on became a very prominent architect, who wrote the famous treatise on architecture. But he also he organized, with the agreement of the Bishop of Florence and also the Medici family, a poetry contest. The poetry contest was set in Florence Cathedral, ostensibly to celebrate the completion of the dome, which had been constructed by his dear friend Brunelleschi. And the poetry contest was centered around a particular theme. The theme was friendship. Friendship among equals, or friendship among your divine. In other words, friendship with God, with Christ. So it kind of mediated between these different realms. But what I just wanted to highlight in this was the way in which the place in which the contest took place had certain kind of resonance, analogies between built form and language. The competition actually was required to be performed in the Vulgare, not in Latin. Again, a kind of strange initiative in a church dedicated to the sacred, presenting our equals, our friends, as well as our divine, and communicating it through the languages which would have been understood by everyone. And the dome itself was the thing that was being celebrated. So in the course of the competition, the people who actually sat in the jury of the contest were the same people who were actually debating about language in Salisbury novella, which I just described earlier on. So this happened about 5 years later, and when the dome was nearly finished, and the competition apparently took place within the crossing of the basilica, literally with the dome above, you can see in this image here. So the contest actually then, Alberti himself also wrote a poem, but he never submitted it. He simply used his as a kind of a document of reflection. It forms part of one of his treatises called Della Familia. And in the course of the competition, a final decision had to be made about who was going to win the competition. And a decision couldn't be made. There were various disputes among members of the committee, the judging panel, including Poggio Bracciolini, I referred to, the book hunter. And what they finally decided was that the laurel wreath, which was the wreath of the ordained poet, would be awarded not to any individual, but to the dome. The dome was crowned with the laurel wreath. So the idea, in a sense, is the dome becomes the crowning glory of poetry, becomes the crowning glory of the vulgar language, the language of the people, the language of the Tuscans, the language of Florence and the whole of Tuscany, the shared language of friendship between people, between different elements of society. So this idea of the sharedness through language and how architecture embodies that is really what's the absolute essence here in this understanding of the relationship between language and architecture. I just wanted to refer to this. In the prologue to Della Pittura, the treatise on painting, which Alberti had actually written, he wrote it both in Latin and in the vulgar tongue. Probably the vulgar tongue in the Tuscan dialect before he wrote into Latin, in order to make it accessible to artists who couldn't read Latin, to his friends and colleagues. working in Florence. But in the prologue, he actually dedicates the treatise to Brunelleschi, but he doesn't dedicate it to Brunelleschi's achievements as the inventor of perspective, or certainly the guy who experimented in perspective, which you would expect, but actually dedicates it to Brunelleschi, the architect and miracle worker for the design of the dome. So there's some relationship between the treatise and its language, Vulgate, and the dome. And here we see an interesting idea. We see the Vulgate, unsupported by any formal system of grammar, of which Alberti recognized in the treatise that he actually put together, Grammaticetta, being analogous to the unsupported dome. The dome had no centering. It was constructed without centering. It was a miraculous self-supporting structure. So in the actual text, it says, within the, I'll just read the highlighted bit, that where, so when man, however hard of heart or jealous, could not praise Brunelleschi, the architect, when he sees how much, could not praise Brunelleschi enough, the architect, when he sees here such an enormous construction towering over the skies, vast enough to cover the entire Tuscan population with its shadow, and done without the aid of beams or elaborate wood support. So the idea of it's kind of self-supporting. It just sits up there. Surely a feat of engineering, if I'm not mistaken, that people do not believe possible these days, and was probably equally unknown and unimaginable among the ancients. So this idea that this thing is a kind of miracle entity, but also the way in which its shadow casts its eternal shadow over the landscape and over the populace of the Tuscans and the Tuscan people and their language. This is what to me is kind of interesting, and how that idea became really the kind of essence of the notion of language, which is not just in the way that Heidegger describes it. It's not just a communicative tool, but actually it's something which relates directly to our sense of being in a world, being in a space, being in a terrain. The idea that architecture is the thing that is the embodiment of that communicative field that actually underpin the whole of the Renaissance. And this particular example, I think, is powerful enough to convey that. I think that's it. Sorry, I had to rush that. I do apologize.
Thanks very much, Nick. So, two exquisite, fascinating presentations, which have brought us almost to the end of the seminar. We have 8 official minutes remaining of the seminar. And I normally have quite a strict policy of not going on past 8 p.m. However, I'm aware that perhaps there are members of the audience who would like to have some participation in a bit of conversation. So audience members, please don't feel you have to stay. Well, you don't have to stay at any time, of course. You are here voluntarily, I hope. But if you want to leave at 8 o'clock, please do. And if you have questions, then please put them in the chat. I suggest we just go on for another 20 minutes to honour the fact that we haven't had a chance to have any questions. So first of all, I will invite Jane McAllister. Are you still here? Oh, you left. Oh, she had a question. Well, in that case, I will.
Peter's was before that, wasn't it?
Yes, no, I was choosing them in the chair's order. And I was, in honesty, trying to get a woman's face on the screen for a moment, apart from mine. But she's gone. So let's go to Peter. If he's still here. Peter Newby, are you still here?
You're muted, Peter.
I wanted to, well, thank you very much, first of all, but I wanted to ask them, talk about the tradition and trying to learn from the inside of these festivals. So but I thought that Mussolini reinstituted this sort of festival as part of his Italianization of Italy, sort of 50 years after reunification, TCI guides and all the different methodologies. And does that make a difference to your analysis that was sort of reinvented?
No, it's interesting because I'll try and be as brief as possible, bearing in mind I've done a lot of speaking already. But the important part is, I mean, the Medicis also tried to adapt the feasts for their own power as well, and they stopped, and they adapted the Feast of the Magi instead, and that's partially down to the resistance of the festivals. And I think the resistance of the festivals themselves, because they have a traditional form, to be co-opted for particular political aims. And so the argument is probably because festivals have amongst their iconography a reversal as much as a reinforcement of the current orders of society. For example, if you look at the Calcio Storico, these brutal, big, fighting men who are usually the bottom of the sort of society in terms of the hierarchy suddenly become like, you know, the most important men of the day. And this reversal means that my guess is that when Mussolini did do it, and he was remaking a feast that had already been remade on various occasions. He did the tug of war, the jousting, the tug of war in Pisa, the jousting. There's several of them throughout the country, but in the end, you can't subvert them. You know, they have their own life. I think that's the point. So yes, they were remade, but if you look at them and compare them with, say, something like The Triumph of the Will, you know, the film, Lili Riefenstahl's film of the German festivals of light, they're completely different. There's a sense of disorder at the heart of them, which is a part of civic organization. And so if you revive a civic festival, you revive its resistance to order as much as its acceptance of it. So yes, he did do it, but that's why it survived beyond him, because the relationship between the city and its people became, they re-recognized the value of such things. And that's why, in a sense, the relationship between the contemporary feast and the historical feast is such an interesting window onto the civic understanding of the city itself in its historicity. It's not just Mussolini, it's a whole history that's unraveled in front of you.
Thank you.
That was a really great answer, really interesting, Christian. I've got so many things I'd like to say, but with the limited time, I'm just going to go straight on to the next question. Punya, you wanted to know about vulgare.
Hi there, thank you very much both for the presentations. So this is my first contact with the idea of this vulgare in relation to language. So yeah, really interesting, thank you. I just wondered, do we see this sort of phenomenon, do we see it in contemporary societies? Or is it something that is that's just a sort of historic phenomenon?
That's a difficult question to answer, really. I think in our kind of globalized world, it's very difficult to. I mean, my argument is not just about the language per se, but it's the situatedness of the language, if you see what I mean. By which I mean, the Tuscan dialect was spoken within a region, so it had kind of regional specificity. If you walked outside the region of Tuscany, the Principality, you would be entering an area with a different dialect of Italian. So there was this kind of relationship between geography and the cities that exist within it and the countryside and the language. So that idea of this kind of exchange, this intimacy between the kind of the physical existence of humans and their modes of exchange is something that probably doesn't exist. It probably exists in parts of the world, but very, very less and less, and very rarely. And I think the reality is that our culture is so dominated in the globalized world by the English language, for example, or that we have the dominance of certain kinds of languages, I guess, in regions where other languages are disappearing. What is particularly interesting, I think, in the context of the threat of biodiversity, for example. There have been a number of studies done of languages, and we talk about the destruction of cultures running directly parallel with the destruction of biodiversity. And do you know that, I can't remember what the statistic is, but it's something quite alarming. It's something like 20 or 30 languages disappearing every 3 or 4 months in the world. So languages are disappearing because societies are disappearing, because people are leaving communities, working in cities, traveling away. So languages themselves are becoming extinct, a bit like, you know, species of animals and plants becoming extinct. So there is an interesting correlation between culture and whether this idea of preserving culture, which is a very difficult and highly controversial issue, and this idea of a landscape and you know, the preservation of life forms in our landscape. So that's an interesting part of the very specifically the contemporary situation about languages.
Can I add something to this as well? Because I think what's really important, the one person you didn't mention was obviously Boccaccio, who followed on from Dante in Florence. And it's said of Boccaccio wrote the Decameron, which is 10 tales per day over 10 days, or 10 days, or I can't remember how many days. It's 10 days, is it? I can't remember how many outside.
Days, yeah.
They're escaping the plague. Yeah. And the stories are in the Vulgare, and the content is. I mean, I think this is the other thing that's important. It's not only the use of language, it's the content. And so many commentators talk about the court life, because Latin historically was not only the language of the church and scholarship, but also in many cases the language of court and governance, government documents. That the shift of the use of the vulgar tongue into the houses of the middle classes in Florence gradually changed the form or the understanding of the salon life that was going on within them. And so what you get with the use of the Vulgare is also the language of the street seller coming into the rather rarefied world of the salon. And this change affects the spaces themselves. And so and that's sort of an understood part of that process. If you talk about that in a contemporary setting, I think probably the closest you get is things more like dialects or street talk, different types of patois that become then a part of, you know, bourgeois dinner table talk or something. And then the notion that the language itself brings with it the culture of the street to the table, hence the very middle class notion of politeness and don't use that language at the table. This sense of decorum that comes with particular uses of language. But let's not forget that all of this is, when we're talking about how it affects the spatial qualities, but someone like Walter Ong would say language restructures consciousness, this relationship between not only speaking but writing, which is the literacy that goes along with the rise in the vulgar tongue. The increase in literacy that goes on through the Renaissance is also a critical part of the way life changes, because memory changes and the way people engage in telling stories change within the spaces of the city. So it's quite a complex landscape. And I think that, whilst Nick is right about the losing of some languages, I think that transition between the street and the salon is a constant thing that's been going on and will continue to go on in contemporary life as it has done for centuries.
Morris, oh, sorry, Nick, go ahead. I was going to bring Morris in with his comment about parades and ritual.
Reply specifically to Christian's point, which is really important. I mean, when we look at, this is the problem with so much scholarship actually on Renaissance Italy, is that there is a kind of division. There's certain things that you know, art historians or cultural historians ignore. If you look at somebody like Brunelleschi, you know, this kind of great figure, nobody talks about his poetry. And least of all, nobody talks about his street poetry. He was a street poet, Brunelleschi. He was a very close friend of a barber called Bucchiello. Bucchiello, which is nicknamed Little Bridge, he was actually a street poet. And he had friends in high circles. He had friends with the Medicis. He was uneducated, but he could write exquisite poetry and very humorous poetry. And Brunelleschi was a member of this little inner sanctum of street poets who would meet in his barbershop, just next to the Piazza della Signoria. And so this idea that language actually was something absolutely Christian, the idea Christians pointing out about the idea of the street life, the cultural life. It was the way in which people exchanged ideas, very much immediate within the culture. Sorry, I've frozen. Oh, it looks like my sacrificial thing. Sorry. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, that was just a point I was just raising. Yeah. Anyway, sorry.
Maurice, did you want to make your comment about Sierra Leone?
Yes, it was in response to the question about whether these approaches to binding the city together were relevant today. And I just wanted to point out that we've been looking at Sierra Leone, or Freetown in Sierra Leone, for quite a long time. And we were quite amazed to find this parade that goes through. It started at about the time of decolonization, where English is still the main language for a diverse group of peoples. And it's not just different tribal languages, but it's also Muslim, Christian. And Freetown is an amazing city because it does have such a diverse range of people. And it's not so much rich and poor or sophisticated and common. It's more about different interpretations, more like Jerusalem, where that Christian was mentioning before, where you have different interpretations of what's there. And so they have this parade which goes through the streets once a year, that binds the city together in the way that Christian has described before in his PhD. There's a float from all the small to medium-sized businesses, all a deck out of float, and it goes around the city, showing that the whole city belongs to all of them, and that all of them need to pull together because there's no colonial power anymore. And it sort of works, really. And it is one of the most cosmopolitan, relatively small capital cities in West Africa, and it feels, in a strange sort of way, very homely when you're there. It's quite emotional, I think. Just I wanted to add that to say that it still works today for relatively new cities. I mean, it's 200 years old, but it's nothing like the Renaissance cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Maurice.
Yeah,
Did you want to respond to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really really key, actually. And I think one of the reasons why I wanted to pick up on methodology today was that, I've been at obviously many conferences, and one of the things that one sees recurring within much architectural methodology at the moment, or methodology, particularly in the social science and the sort of history and philosophy of architecture, is that people are getting extraordinarily competent at describing difference. And what you get is a more and more detailed account of what is the difference between people. So when I first start talking to people about my festival work, they say, well, who owns the festival? And you say, well, the city, and it's a civic thing. And people, yeah, but who owns it? And this notion of difference, whether it be through religion, gender, race, sexuality, whatever, is absolutely central to much thought. And my answer to this is generally that, that may be really significant. It may be the most significant thing. It may be 99% about difference, but I'm interested in the 1% that isn't about difference, that is about bonding. It is about the civic and the center. And that usually stops people because it admits that, their place within difference, within the discussion of difference, is significant. I'm not necessarily saying mine is more important, but I'm saying it interests me more. And I think what Maurice has just described is the urge. The urge is still there within people to come together even in the most fraught situations. And if I go back to the paper, they don't pour their own individual histories out and into a place of no value. The place has value, and it begins to reinforce the values that they have. It's a part of those relationships. It's that photograph of the football players in the stadium or in the city. If you play out in the city, there is reason, there is meaning there. And that's why something like a civic procession will always urge towards the civic representation, the spaces of civic representation in the city. Just as a final point, if you think about flash mobs, if you see a flash mob in a outside Buckingham Palace or in a railway station or town hall, it looks like a protest, or it looks like something civic. If you see it in a shopping mall, it just looks like entertainment. And that difference, that architecture does have an effect in this, is critical, but difficult often if you're looking at things in a very reductive way to argue for. But it absolutely is central to all of these ideas.
Thank you, Christian. That was a really extremely intriguing response. I know Matthew is keen to make a comment. I just would like to say something very briefly before that, which is that this conversation is really ringing a bell for me with my own research in Tottenham High Road, where in every shop, it's a super diverse location. In every shop, a different language is spoken. In every shop, there's a different cultural milieu, and it's the nature of the high street itself that enables convivial relationships to occur between all those people, and for me to enter any one of those shops and conduct an exchange. And it's the architectural depth, which is rather like, I think, Christian, the variation in participation that you were describing in the match. You don't have to know the whole shape of the high street to be able to engage with the guy selling the mobile phones at the front of the mobile phone shop. Matthew.
Yeah, hi, thank you. I mean, I put quite an extended comment early on in relation to Christian's reference to Camilo Bueno, who's an old colleague of mine. But I was triggered a little bit by the reference to the dispositif and the idea that the city is a context for performance, and what that performance is about is making that cityness, that character of collective belonging, out of the people themselves, sometimes in spite of the backdrop. And I'm hearing, Jane, what you're saying about the depth structure in that dialogue between the spatial and the social infrastructure, if you like, but also, Florence, which both speakers have treated as their context tonight, is an acme city in relation to the European tradition. But also, when Morris talks about Freetown, I'm very energized, because I think Freetown is a city which is so problematic, where the spatial context is almost the enemy, or you cannot trust it. You can't be sure that when you hit the switch on the wall, the lights will come on or the water will come out of the tap. So this idea of order is something that is often about the people. The people are the infrastructure. And the notion that there is commonality between Florence and Freetown, to me, is very exciting. And I think in some ways, it's a direction for our research that is more exciting and a way to navigate very usefully. There's current a debate that we have about decolonizing our curriculum, because a lot of our curriculum is actually creating openings to this decolonization process. If we think about cities of places where the spaces and the spatial understanding created by the people as the infrastructure in relation to this participant backdrop of the architecture can be more provocatively framed. That's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you. We've only got a few minutes left. I wonder, the two speakers, well, there's a question very early in the chat from one of our students who sadly had to leave, Max McCall, who just wanted some clarification, Christian, on, I'm hoping you might watch this recording later, about what were the methods that you used to engage with the festival?
Well, in the end, in terms, are we talking about tools or?
Well, his question says, the themes sound very interesting. Can I ask for a quick recap? Which different methods of analysis of the festival were being compared or evaluated?
Well, in the talk, which is probably, I think, what he's referring to.
Yeah.
Early on, it was really post-structuralism, I suppose, the heart of Eden Solno's version of competing dialogues, and then trying to understand and the Foucaultian world as well. I didn't really go into structuralism, the sort of world of Durkheim, very much. But the Comte is the positivist notion, which is in a sense the idea that science could be a useful method for the evaluation. So in a sense, it was incomplete as a sort of a full mapping of how you get to hermeneutics, because in the end, once you've realized where some of the difficulties lie in not using what I had grown up with, if you like, I went back and then I described what hermeneutics could offer, and that's obviously a separate talk. I thought what would be useful in a sense today would be often, you know, there's a almost an acceptance that everyone knows what we mean when we say why do we work with hermeneutics, or why aren't we work? What does method mean? And what I really wanted to do today was to sort of to show that if you use some ways of thinking, it won't necessarily get you to an answer, and therefore the question in itself has within it some implied methods, and that people, as a way of understanding what people mean by method, which is usually something that architects only sort of arrive in front of when they think about doing research, when in fact they do it all the time, but their own methods are about the way in which they're evaluating different types of problems. So yeah, it was really just a sense of trying to say, well, look, what is something like, what's the difference? Because everyone talks about, with us, you know, there's lots of talk about Heidegger and Gadamer, but what happens if you talk about the people who aren't those? What are they saying about it, and why are they different? So that was really what I was trying to at least allude to today, which is what is positivism in relation to what we do, and why isn't it useful for some of the things that we like looking at?
And Nick, do you want to say a couple of words about your methods of engagement with the topic? Because of course you can't go and walk around 15th century Florence.
Well, not now. Well, no, not well. I mean, it's 15th century.
Or you kind of can, you think?
Oh, I think you can. Yes. I mean, you know, I think history is relative. It's something which, it's not just about the physical fabric of the city, but it's what you read and how you use written text as a way of reimagining, you know, urban settings. So there are, in a way, I think this issue of method can be very useful, can also be highly problematic if one gets stuck, if you like, on a particular methodological approach, and it kind of puts barriers down sometimes when you're doing a piece of research. And I think Christian's point about how architects only start to think about method when they're doing a piece of academic research, but they're doing research anyway. Well, good architects are in the line of their work. I think is equally true actually in good research, where methods sometimes evolve. My sense is that students who do research discover the methods as they work through an inquiry. It's not something you necessarily put up at the beginning and then start to apply it. Sometimes that can become very limiting, and sometimes you lose a sense of the research, the body of material that you're looking at. So to me, it's a kind of journey. You know, research is a journey. And for me, when I did this particular research, I spent a lot of time just wandering around the streets of Florence, and likewise in Rome. I obviously visited lots of buildings. I would sit and draw. I haven't shown all the drawings I did, which was part of the research that I did. I talked to a lot of people. I obviously visited, you know, museums, sat in libraries, read huge amounts of text, a lot of secondary source material, obviously, but also primary source. Sometimes I would use the text as a way of navigating territory, and not just physically navigating destinations, but also thinking about the symbolic significance of locations, of settings, and imagining what they would have been like, you know, in the Renaissance, so that particular moment in time, that crucial moment in time. So Brunelleschi's perspective experiments, I've done lots of speculations about just standing in one particular vantage point, imagining what that space would have been like as lived space, not just a piece of geometry, you know, but actually how it was occupied, how it was discoursed, what kind of interactions occurred between people. I think the problem is that we tend to cleanse all of that. We tend to extract all of that in our analytical obsessions with seeking the truth. And in the process, you kind of miss the point, you know, and I think that's where the imagination is part of it. Crucial. A good academic has to have imagination. If you don't have imagination, you don't really get very far. I mean, that's a very controversial issue, because I think many academics dismiss imagination as something dangerous and a kind of digressive, but actually to me it's fundamental.
That seems like a really nice point to end on. Thank you so much, Christian, and thank you so much, Nick, for stepping in at the last minute. That was a really interesting, illuminating seminar, and I'm delighted that your topics fitted so well together.
Thank you.
Usually what I ask everyone to do is to switch your camera on, or at least just say goodbye before you leave, so that we get a sense of the audience all saying goodbye, that you're all people, not just pixels on a screen.
So goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye. Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Great.
Bye, everyone.
Bye bye.
Thanks very much. That was
Thanks.
great.
Thanks for letting it go longer.